Steve Harvey stopped an entire game show taping when a contestant looked him in the eye and said he missed the old days before people like Steve were on television. What happened in the next 5 minutes wasn't just uncomfortable. It was a reckoning 30 years in the making. The cameras captured every second as Steve did something no black entertainer had ever done on national television. He stopped performing, stopped smiling, and spoke a truth so raw it would reach millions of people within hours. This is the story of 7 words that detonated 3 decades of silence. A moment of accountability so rare it felt impossible. And the transformation that followed when one man finally refused to swallow racism one more time. Because what the contestant didn't know was that he had just said the one thing Steve Harvey had been waiting his entire career to respond to. The Family Feud studio buzzed with its usual electric energy on what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in Los Angeles. Bright lights flooded the stage where 2 families stood behind their podiums, hands hovering over buzzers, eyes locked on the man in the perfectly tailored suit standing between them. Steve Harvey had no idea that in less than 5 minutes, his entire career would be on the line. But right now, in this moment, he was exactly where he'd been 1,000 times before. In complete control, working the crowd with the effortless charisma that had made him one of the most beloved hosts in television history. The audience laughed at his latest quip about someone's terrible answer. That signature Steve Harvey laugh that had become as iconic as the show itself. He adjusted his tie, flashed that $1 million smile, and moved seamlessly into the next round. This was his domain, his kingdom. He'd been doing this for years, perfecting the art of making everyone comfortable, turning awkward moments into comedy gold, transforming nervous contestants into temporary stars. Every gesture was practiced, every reaction calibrated for maximum entertainment value. The show ran like a well-oiled machine, and Steve was the engine that kept it humming. On the left side of the stage stood the Martinez family, their matching blue shirts slightly wrinkled from the nervous sweating that came with being on national television. On the right stood the Hendersons, currently ahead by 60 points and riding high on their winning streak. The contestant at the front of the Henderson podium was a middle-aged white man named Richard, seemingly harmless with his receding hairline and dad jeans. The kind of guy who probably coached Little League and mowed his lawn every Saturday morning. He'd been cracking jokes all afternoon, his family cheering behind him every time he gave an answer. And Steve had been playing along perfectly, giving him just enough attention to make him feel special without letting him dominate the show. Everything felt normal, safe, predictable. The calm before the storm that nobody saw coming. But what nobody in that studio knew was that Steve had reached his breaking point. Not that anyone could tell from looking at him. The mask he wore was impenetrable, forged over 3 decades of performing in spaces that weren't built for him, refined through countless moments of swallowing comments that landed like small cuts, perfected through years of choosing survival over authenticity. Beneath that smile lived 30 years of swallowed rage, carefully compartmentalized and buried so deep that even Steve himself sometimes forgot it was there. The cameras captured his every move as he read the next survey question from the card in his hand, his voice booming through the studio with that perfect blend of enthusiasm and anticipation. The question was about television shows, something innocuous and family-friendly, the kind of softball setup that usually generated easy laughs and predictable answers. Richard leaned forward, his hand already moving toward the buzzer before Steve even finished reading. He had that look contestants get when they think they've got the perfect answer, that confidence bordering on cockiness that comes from being on a winning streak. The contestant was about to say 7 words that would detonate 3 decades of silence. Richard slammed the buzzer, the sound echoing through the studio like a starting gun. Steve turned to him with that practiced smile, eyebrows raised in expectation, ready to react to whatever answer came next. The audience leaned forward in their seats, that collective anticipation that came before every reveal. Richard's family clapped and whooped behind him, already celebrating an answer that hadn't been given yet. Everything was following the script, the familiar rhythm of the show flowing exactly as it had in thousands of tapings before. Richard gave his answer to the survey question, something about classic sitcoms that was probably on the board. But then he kept talking. He looked directly at Steve with a familiarity that crossed invisible boundaries, a comfort level that came from never having to think about those boundaries in the first place. He told Steve, with a smile still plastered across his face, that he really missed the old days before people like Steve were on television. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. For a fraction of a second, nothing changed. Steve's smile remained frozen in place, his body still angled toward Richard in that open, welcoming posture he'd mastered over years of hosting. The audience hadn't fully processed what they'd just heard, their brains still catching up to their ears. Richard stood there looking pleased with himself, as if he'd just delivered a compliment rather than detonated a bomb disguised as nostalgia right in the middle of a game show taping. Then time fractured. Steve's smile didn't fade so much as die, the light behind it switching off like someone had cut the power. His body went completely still in a way that made everyone in the studio suddenly aware they were watching something shift, some fundamental change occurring in real time. The mask Steve had worn for 3 decades was about to crack wide open, and every person in that room could feel it happening, even if they couldn't name what it was. The audience's laughter caught in their throats. Someone gasped, the sound sharp and startling in the sudden quiet. The producers in the control booth leaned closer to their monitors, hands hovering over buttons they weren't sure they should press. Richard's family stopped clapping, their smiles faltering as they sensed something had gone wrong, but couldn't quite identify what. Richard himself still stood there with that oblivious grin, waiting for Steve's trademark reaction, expecting a laugh or a joke or one of those perfectly timed facial expressions that always brought down the house. This wasn't just another taping. This was the day everything changed. Steve's eyes locked onto Richard with an intensity that made the contestant's smile finally begin to waver. In that moment, Steve was doing calculations he'd been doing his entire career, weighing the cost of speaking versus the cost of silence, measuring the risk of authenticity against the safety of performance, deciding in a split second whether to swallow one more comment or finally say something back. Every instinct screamed at him to deflect, to make a joke, to smooth it over and move on like he always did. That's what had kept him employed for 30 years, that ability to make everyone comfortable even when he was the one absorbing the discomfort. But something was different this time. Maybe it was the casual way Richard had said it, as if it were a compliment rather than an insult. Maybe it was the 3 decades of similar moments that had piled up like stones in Steve's chest until he couldn't breathe under the weight anymore. Maybe it was simply that he was tired. Tired of performing, tired of protecting, tired of being the one who always had to smile and swallow and move on. The studio held its collective breath, sensing they were standing on the edge of something unprecedented. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every micro-expression that crossed Steve's face as he made his decision. Producers exchanged panicked glances, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let whatever was about to happen play out. The audience sat frozen, the energy in the room transforming from entertainment to tension so thick you could choke on it. Steve took a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest, from that place where he'd been storing 30 years of moments just like this one. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His shoulders squared in a way that made him seem taller, more solid, immovable. When he spoke, His voice was different than it had been just seconds before. Still controlled, still measured, but carrying an edge that no one in that studio had ever heard from him. He told the production team to stop rolling, not as a request, but as a statement of fact. This show was stopping, right here, right now. The technical director looked at the executive producer, who looked at the network representative, all of them frozen in uncertainty because there was no protocol for this. No playbook for what to do when your host decides to halt production in the middle of a taping. But Steve wasn't asking for permission. He was done asking for permission. The countdown clock on the board stopped ticking. The theme music that had been playing softly in the background cut out abruptly. The audience realized with dawning awareness that something extraordinary was happening, that they weren't just watching a game show anymore. They were witnessing something raw and real and completely unscripted. Steve turned his full attention back to Richard, who had finally stopped smiling. The contestant's face showed the first flickers of confusion, maybe even the beginning of understanding that he'd said something he shouldn't have. But it was too late. The words were out there, hanging in the air like smoke from an explosion, and there was no taking them back. Time stopped. But what the contestant didn't know was that he had just said the one thing Steve Harvey had been waiting 30 years to respond to. The comment hung in the air like poison, spreading through the studio with invisible toxicity. Richard's words about missing the old days before people like Steve were on television detonated like a grenade in the middle of what had been, just seconds before, a perfectly ordinary game show taping. The audience gasped in scattered waves. Some understood immediately what they'd just heard, their faces contorting with shock and secondhand embarrassment, while others sat confused, their brains still processing why the energy in the room had suddenly curdled into something dangerous and unfamiliar. Richard stood there at his podium, still wearing that smile, completely oblivious to the bomb he'd just dropped, waiting for Steve's trademark laugh and that perfectly timed reaction that always made contestants feel like they were part of the joke rather than the butt of it. His family behind him had gone quiet, sensing something had shifted, but not yet understanding what. The cameras kept rolling, capturing everything in high definition, every micro-expression, every frozen moment, every second of what was about to become either the most buried footage in television history or the most viral moment in game show memory. The next 60 seconds would either destroy Steve's career or change everything. Steve's face went through a transformation that felt both instantaneous and agonizingly slow. His smile froze first, locked in place like a photograph, still technically present, but completely devoid of warmth or authenticity. Then it died, the light behind it switching off like someone had cut the power to his entire expression. His eyes, which had been crinkled with performative joy just moments before, went flat and hard. The atmosphere turned to ice, the temperature in the studio dropping so precipitously that people in the audience actually shivered. The studio became a tomb. Every producer in the control booth leaned closer to their monitors, hands hovering over buttons and switches, exchanging panicked glances that communicated entire conversations without words. They knew they were watching something unprecedented unfold, something that didn't fit into any category or protocol they'd been trained for. This was either going to be buried forever in some vault where problematic footage went to die, or it was going to become the most viral moment in game show history. There was no middle ground, no safe option, no way to smooth this over and pretend it hadn't happened. Inside Steve's head, a war was raging. Every instinct he'd honed over 3 decades of survival in an industry that wasn't built for him screamed at him to smile, deflect, make a joke, move on. That's what he'd always done. swallow the comment, absorb the discomfort, protect everyone else's comfort at the expense of his own dignity. He could feel the familiar script trying to activate, the performance mode that had kept him employed and beloved and safe for 30 years. Just laugh it off. Make it funny. Turn the awkwardness into entertainment. That's what Steve Harvey does. That's what everyone expects. But something was different this time. He was tired. Bone deep, soul exhausted, 3 decades of swallowing racism tired. The weight of all those moments when he'd smiled through comments and deflected with humor and made white people comfortable while carrying the burden of their casual racism had finally become too much to bear. He couldn't do it anymore. He physically could not force his face into that smile one more time, could not make his voice produce another deflecting joke, could not perform palatability for one more second. What the contestant didn't realize was that he had just opened a door that could never be closed. The studio held its collective breath, hundreds of people frozen in their seats, sensing they were standing on the precipice of something they'd never witnessed before. The producers sensed danger radiating from the stage like heat from a fire. The audience felt the shift in the air, that electric charge that comes right before lightning strikes. Even Richard, oblivious as he was, started to notice that something wasn't right, his smile beginning to falter at the edges as Steve's silence stretched from seconds into something that felt eternal. Steve made a decision that could cost him everything. He was going to respond, not with a joke, not with deflection, not with the carefully calibrated performance that had kept him safe and employed and beloved. With the truth. Raw, unfiltered, career-destroying truth. The mask was coming off, and there was no going back. Steve Harvey was about to do something no black entertainer had ever done on national television: refuse to perform, refuse to smile, refuse to make white people comfortable with their own racism. The magnitude of what he was about to do settled over him like a weight, and somewhere in the back of his mind, he understood that the next words out of his mouth would either end his career or change the entire conversation around race and entertainment, and the price black performers pay for success. He told the production team again to stop rolling, his voice carrying an authority that made it clear this wasn't a request or a suggestion. This was happening. The technical director finally hit the button that stopped the cameras, though everyone knew that didn't matter. Dozens of phones in the audience were probably already recording, capturing every moment for the social media wildfire that was inevitably coming. Steve turned his full attention to Richard, and the intensity of his gaze made the contestant physically step back from his podium. The smile had completely vanished from Richard's face now, replaced by confusion and the first flickering of something that might have been fear. He looked to his family for support, but they were frozen, unable to help him, unable to do anything but watch as the situation spiraled into territory none of them had anticipated. Steve asked Richard to repeat what he'd just said. Not aggressively, not with raised voice or obvious anger. Calmly, almost gently. But underneath that calm was volcanic fury, 3 decades of suppressed rage bubbling just beneath the surface. And everyone in that studio could feel it. The request to repeat the comment wasn't about Steve not hearing it. It was about making Richard hear his own words, making him confront what had just come out of his mouth, forcing him to say it again now that the atmosphere had changed and the safety of casual racism had evaporated. Richard stammered, suddenly understanding that he'd stepped in something he couldn't easily wipe off. He tried to backtrack, saying he didn't mean anything by it, that Steve had misunderstood, that he was just talking about television in general. But Steve wasn't letting him off that easy. 30 years of silence shattered in an instant as Steve cut through the deflection and asked again, with that same terrifying calm, for Richard to repeat exactly what he'd said about missing the old days before people like Steve were on television. The contestant's face went through its own transformation, confusion giving way to dawning horror as he began to understand, really understand, what his words had meant. His mouth opened and closed without sound, his brain finally catching up to the reality of the situation. He'd thought he was being nostalgic, maybe even complimentary in some twisted way. But Steve was about to show him exactly what that nostalgia actually represented. Steve began to speak, his voice still, controlled but carrying a weight that made every word land like a physical blow. He started unpacking what the old days actually meant, not the sanitized television version that Richard was nostalgic for, but the real history that those words represented. He talked about segregation, about exclusion, about the violence and humiliation and systematic dehumanization that characterized the era Richard claimed to miss. His words were precise, measured, devastating in their clarity. The old days meant separate water fountains and restaurants where black people couldn't eat. The old days meant black performers entertaining white audiences through back doors because they weren't allowed to use the main entrance. The old days meant knowing your place and staying in it, or facing consequences that ranged from unemployment to violence to death. That's what Richard was nostalgic for. A time when people who looked like Steve knew better than to take up space on national television. When the entertainment industry was the exclusive domain of white people, and everyone else existed only in the margins, if they existed at all. 3 decades of rage were about to pour out, and Richard was about to drown in it. Steve's voice grew more intense as he continued, though he never raised it to a shout. The control made it more powerful, more terrifying. He talked about the cost of being where he was, standing on that stage in that suit, hosting that show. He described sleeping in his car when he was starting out in comedy, going days without eating, performing in clubs that didn't want him there but needed black comedians to fill time slots. He explained what it meant to be 3 times as good just to be considered half as qualified. To carry the weight of representing an entire race every time you stepped in front of a camera. To perform palatability so constantly that you sometimes forgot what your authentic self even felt like. The audience sat frozen, some with tears streaming down their faces, others with mouths hanging open in shock. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was witnessing, testimony, truth-telling of a kind that never happened on game shows or in spaces designed for white comfort. Some people were crying from recognition, finally hearing articulated what they'd lived but never been able to name. Others were crying from shame, confronting their own complicity in the systems Steve was describing. All of them understood they were watching something unprecedented, a moment when the performance stopped and reality came crashing through. Richard's face had gone pale, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. He looked like he wanted to disappear, to somehow rewind time and unsay the words that had started this avalanche. His family behind him stood motionless, trapped in their matching blue shirts, unable to help or intervene, or do anything but bear witness to his reckoning. The producers in the control booth were paralyzed, watching their carefully managed show transform into something raw and uncontrolled and potentially career-ending for everyone involved. Every instinct screamed at them to cut the feed, clear the studio, do damage control. But they were frozen too, caught between protocol and the recognition that trying to shut this down might be worse than letting it play out. Steve wasn't finished. He looked directly into Richard's eyes and delivered the knockout blow, explaining that the nostalgia for the old days was really just a longing for a time when black people knew their place, when white people didn't have to share space or power or platforms, when the world was organized in a way that centered white comfort above all else. Richard's comment wasn't innocent or nostalgic. It was a wish for a time when people like Steve didn't exist in his field of vision, didn't take up space on his television screen, didn't have the audacity to be successful and visible and unavoidable. The studio remained silent when Steve finished, the weight of his words settling over everyone like ash after an explosion. Richard stood there visibly shaken, his face a mixture of shame and horror and the terrible understanding that comes when someone holds up a mirror and forces you to see yourself clearly for the first time. No one moved. No one spoke. The moment stretched and held, suspended in the space between what had been and what would come next. But Steve wasn't done. What came next would make millions of people around the world stop and listen. Steve was about to say something that would either end his career or start a revolution. The silence in the studio stretched and held, thick enough to choke on, as he gathered himself for what came next. His control was absolute, terrifying in its precision. He wasn't yelling, wasn't losing his composure, wasn't giving anyone the easy out of dismissing him as angry or emotional. That control made everything more powerful, more devastating. This was volcanic truth erupting after decades of suppression, and everyone in that room understood they were about to be buried in it. The studio became a courtroom, and Steve was judge, jury, and witness. He continued speaking, his voice steady but carrying an intensity that made people physically lean back in their seats. Steve began explaining in excruciating detail what the old days actually were for Black people, not the sanitized nostalgia that Richard had been pining for, but the brutal reality that those words represented. He named the racism explicitly: segregation, Jim Crow, systematic exclusion, violence both casual and calculated. No euphemisms, no softening, no protection for white comfort. Every word he spoke was a nail in the coffin of his carefully constructed public image, the likable entertainer who never made white audiences uncomfortable. Steve described what it cost to be standing where he was right now, in that suit on that stage hosting that show. He talked about sleeping in, his car for 3 years when he was starting out in comedy, his clothes wadded up in garbage bags, going days without eating because there was no money and no safety net, and no guarantee that any of this would ever work out. He described the hunger, not metaphorical hunger for success, but literal stomach-cramping hunger that made him weak and dizzy while he tried to perform in clubs that barely wanted him there. Words like bullets, each one hitting its target. He talked about the doors that slammed in his face, the opportunities that evaporated when he walked into rooms, the way he learned early that being twice as good meant you might get half the recognition if you were lucky. Steve explained what the old days meant for Black performers, entertaining white audiences through back doors because they weren't allowed to use the main entrance, performing in venues where they couldn't eat in the restaurant or sleep in the hotel, making white people laugh and then being reminded they weren't actually welcome in those spaces. He described legends like Sammy Davis Jr. and Nat King Cole, brilliant performers who had to smile through indignities that would have broken lesser people, who entertained in venues where they couldn't even use the same bathroom as the audience they performed for. The producers knew they were watching a man sacrifice everything for one moment of truth. In the control booth, panic had set in. Producers exchanged frantic glances and whispered urgent conversations into headsets, trying to figure out how to handle what was unfolding on their stage. This would never air, couldn't air. This was career suicide, a disaster in real time, a liability nightmare that would have lawyers and executives screaming for weeks. Every instinct screamed at them to shut it down, clear the studio, do damage control. But they were paralyzed, trapped between protocol and the recognition that stopping this might create an even bigger problem than letting it play out. Steve's voice was a weapon he'd never allowed himself to use, and now that it was unleashed, there was no stopping it. He talked about the performance of palatability, explaining in devastating detail what it meant to code switch constantly, to modulate your voice and your mannerisms and your entire presence to make white people comfortable. Steve described carrying the weight of representation every single day, knowing that every mistake, every misstep, every moment of humanity would be used to judge not just him, but every black person who came after him. He explained what it meant to be successful in an industry that wasn't built for you, to know that your presence was tolerated rather than welcomed, to understand that you were always one wrong move away from confirming every stereotype they already believed about you. This wasn't just a response. This was 30 years of pain pouring out all at once. Steve talked about the meetings where he was the only black person in the room, where decisions were made about his career, his image, his future by people who had never lived a single day in his skin. He described being told to be more relatable, which really meant be less black. He explained the exhaustion of watching white comedians tell jokes that bombed and get second chances, third chances, endless chances, while he knew that one bad show could end everything he'd worked for. The double standard wasn't subtle. It was glaring, obvious, built into the very foundation of the industry. Richard's face had gone through a complete transformation. The confusion from earlier had given way to understanding, and the understanding had curdled into horror as the full weight of what he'd said crashed down on him. The contestant was being dismantled piece by piece, his casual nostalgia revealed for what it actually was. A longing for a time when he didn't have to share space with people who made him uncomfortable, when the world was organized in a way that centered his comfort above all else. He looked like he wanted to disappear, to somehow crawl out of his own skin and escape the reckoning that Steve was delivering. The audience was sobbing. Some cried from recognition, finally hearing articulated what they'd lived but never been able to name. The exhaustion of performing and code switching and carrying weight that nobody acknowledged. Others cried from shame, confronting their own complicity in the systems Steve was describing, seeing clearly for the first time how their nostalgia for simpler times was really just nostalgia for a time when certain people knew their place. Still others cried from the sheer power of finally hearing truth spoken without filter or performance, witnessing someone refuse to protect them from reality. Steve's voice grew more intense as he continued, though he still never raised it to a shout. He said he was tired of protecting people from their own racism, tired of making everyone comfortable while he absorbed the discomfort, tired of smiling through comments and deflecting with humor and performing palatability so constantly that he sometimes forgot what authenticity even felt like. 30 years of swallowed rage poured out like a flood, and everyone in the studio was drowning in it. What came next would make the contestant wish he'd never opened his mouth. Steve explained the 3 times as hard for half the recognition reality that defined black excellence in white spaces. He described what it meant to be perfect every single day, because anything less than perfect would be used as evidence that you didn't belong there in the first place. He talked about watching mediocre white performers get opportunities that brilliant black performers were denied, about being told you're too ethnic or too urban or not relatable enough, which were all just coded ways of saying you were too black for white comfort. He described the mental gymnastics required to navigate spaces where your very presence was considered political, where existing authentically was seen as making a statement rather than simply being human. The reckoning had only just begun. Steve looked directly at Richard and delivered the knockout statement that would echo long after this moment ended. He told the contestant that his nostalgia wasn't innocent or harmless. It was a longing for a time when black people knew their place, when white people didn't have to share platforms or power or visibility. When the world was organized in a hierarchy that put people who looked like Richard at the top and people who looked like Steve at the bottom. That's what the old days meant. That's what Richard was really saying when he claimed to miss them. Those old days meant Steve wouldn't be standing on this stage, wouldn't be hosting this show, wouldn't be visible in Richard's living room when he turned on his television. The contestant was drowning in the reality of his own words, his face a portrait of shame and horror and the terrible understanding that comes when someone forces you to see yourself clearly. His family behind him stood frozen, unable to help or intervene, trapped in their matching shirts as witnesses to his unraveling. Richard opened his mouth as if to speak, to apologize or explain or somehow make it better. But Steve wasn't finished. Steve Harvey was burning every bridge, and he didn't care. He demanded accountability, his voice carrying an authority that made it clear this wasn't a request. Intent doesn't erase impact, Steve explained. Saying you didn't mean it that way isn't good enough when the impact is still harm, when the words still carry the weight of centuries of oppression and exclusion. Richard's intentions were irrelevant in the face of what his comment actually communicated, that he wished Steve and people who looked like Steve would disappear from his television screen, would stop taking up space in venues that Richard believed belonged exclusively to white people. Steve made it clear that he was done performing, done smiling through racism, done making others comfortable at the expense of his own dignity. The mask he'd worn for 3 decades was gone, shattered beyond repair, and he had no intention of putting it back on. Whatever came next, whether he lost the show, lost the endorsements, lost everything he'd spent 30 years building, it would be worth it to finally speak truth without filter or performance. He'd rather have his dignity than his career, rather have his authenticity than his likability, rather be honest than successful if those were the only options available. Every word he spoke was setting fire to everything he'd built, and the flames were beautiful. The audience sat transfixed, many still crying, all of them understanding they were witnessing something that would never happen again. A moment when the performance stopped completely and raw reality came crashing through. Some pulled out their phones, recording, despite the no recording policy, instinctively understanding that this needed to be captured. The people who weren't in this room needed to see what was happening. The producers in the control booth were too panicked to notice, too busy trying to figure out how to contain a situation that was already far beyond containment. Steve talked about the toll that performing palatability takes, the way it erodes your sense of self when you're constantly modulating and adjusting and making yourself smaller to fit into spaces that weren't designed for you. He described the exhaustion of being a bridge, of carrying white people across the chasm of their own ignorance while they complained about the ride. He explained what it meant to be successful in an industry that treated your success as a favor rather than something earned, as if he should be grateful for the opportunity to work 3 times as hard for half the recognition. The studio remained absolutely silent except for Steve's voice and the sound of people crying. Even the crew had stopped moving, cameras forgotten, tasks abandoned, everyone frozen in the recognition that they were witnessing history being made. This wasn't just a game show host responding to an inappropriate comment. This was a cultural moment, a reckoning, a line being drawn that couldn't be uncrossed. Steve looked at Richard one more time and said something that landed with the force of a physical blow. He told the contestant that he represented every white person who'd ever smiled while delivering racism, every person who'd ever said they didn't mean it that way after saying something harmful, every person who valued their own comfort over other people's humanity. Richard's comment wasn't unique or unusual. It was just the one that happened to be the final straw. The moment when Steve finally couldn't swallow one more insult disguised as nostalgia. The contestant stood there, visibly shaken. His body language collapsed and defeated. beginning to understand the full weight of what he'd said and what it represented. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the last 10 minutes. The casual confidence from earlier completely evaporated. His family behind him wore expressions of shock and shame, finally understanding what their patriarch had actually said when he claimed to miss the old days. Steve's voice carried a finality as he wrapped up, explaining that this moment, this refusal to smile and deflect and move on, was a gift to every black entertainer who came after him, permission to stop performing palatability, to stop protecting white people from their own racism, to stop sacrificing authenticity for survival. He was done being the bridge that people walked across without ever acknowledging the weight he carried. Done being the translator who made racism palatable by wrapping it in humor. Done being the acceptable black face who made white audiences feel good about themselves. The studio sat in absolute silence when Steve finished speaking. The weight of his words hung in the air like smoke, settling over everyone and everything, changing the atmosphere permanently. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody knew what happened next, because nothing like this had ever happened before. There was no protocol, no playbook, no reference point for what to do when someone stopped performing and started truth-telling in a space designed exclusively for entertainment. Richard looked like he might cry, his face a mixture of shame and horror and the beginning of understanding. His mouth opened and closed without sound, his brain trying and failing to find words adequate to the moment. What could he possibly say? What apology could be sufficient? How do you respond when someone has just explained in devastating detail exactly what your casual comment meant and why it mattered? The producers in the control booth finally sprang into action, making frantic calls to executives and lawyers, trying to figure out how to handle footage that would never air but couldn't be destroyed. A moment that was simultaneously too dangerous to release and too important to bury. They knew they were sitting on something explosive, something that would either ruin careers or change the entire conversation around race and entertainment. Steve stood on that stage, his body language exhausted but unbowed, having finally said everything he'd been holding back for 30 years. The relief was visible on his face, despite the fear that must have been coursing through him. Relief at finally speaking truth, at finally refusing to perform, at finally prioritizing his own dignity over everyone else's comfort. Whatever came next, he'd done the one thing he'd never allowed himself to do before. He'd been completely, unfilteredly honest about what it cost to be a black entertainer in white spaces. The audience remained frozen, many still crying, all of them processing what they'd just witnessed. Some understood immediately that they'd been part of something historic, a moment that would be talked about and analyzed and referenced for years to come. Others were still catching up, their brains trying to reconcile the Steve Harvey they thought they knew with the man who just delivered a truth so raw it felt like being flayed alive. Nobody knew what happened next. The silence stretched and held, suspended in the space between what had been and what would come. Everyone trapped in the aftermath of Steve's reckoning, waiting to see if the world would end or begin. What Steve didn't know was that someone in the audience had recorded every single word, and within hours, his unfiltered truth would reach millions. The taping of Family Feud came to a sudden, jarring halt. The studio lights dimmed, the laughter and cheers of the audience cutting off mid-enthusiasm as the producers scrambled around the set, their faces painted with confusion and concern. Nobody knew the protocol for a moment like this. How to contain the fallout of a host breaking the unspoken rules of performance and decorum in front of millions. Steve's truth still hung in the air, a palpable force that threatened to disrupt everything they had built. Behind the scenes, Network executives convened emergency meetings, their faces flushed with urgency and fear. Damage control became the priority, and legal concerns loomed large over discussions about whether to bury the footage entirely. Would they risk letting it air? What ramifications would arise if they did? But then, news trickled in that sent shockwaves through the room. Someone had recorded it on their phone. The video spread like a virus, infecting every corner of the internet. First, it hit Twitter, then quickly moved to Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Within 3 hours, it was everywhere. Millions of views, trending worldwide. Steve was suddenly the center of a storm he hadn't anticipated. A wildfire ignited by his refusal to remain silent any longer. The response was explosive and polarized. Black entertainers reached out privately, sending messages of gratitude to Steve for saying what they could never bring themselves to articulate. Icons like Denzel Washington, Oprah Winfrey, and Chris Rock sent their support, praising his courage and authenticity. They understood that this moment was bigger than any single individual. It was a clarion call for honesty in a world that often demanded silence. But the backlash came like a tsunami. Conservative commentators flooded the airwaves, attacking him viciously. They called him divisive, said he had overreacted, that he was being ungrateful for the opportunities he'd been given. Social media trolls inundated his mentions with racist slurs and threats, their vitriol a stark reminder of the world's ugliness. A few sponsors got nervous, their loyalty wavering as companies began reviewing contracts and considering distance from an increasingly controversial figure. As the hours slipped by, network executives made concerned phone calls. They debated among themselves whether Steve had gone too far, whether he needed to walk back his statements or issue an apology. For Steve, the bigger problem wasn't the backlash. It was the silence from the network. Every hour that passed without a statement from the executives felt like a countdown to the end. A ticking clock that amplified the fear swirling in his gut. Alone in his dressing room, Steve sat with his phone, watching it explode with notifications. The fear set in thick and heavy. Had he just destroyed everything by refusing to smile through one more insult? He could lose it all. The show, the endorsements, the career he had fought 30 years to build. The terror was real, suffocating, all-consuming. He was standing on the edge of oblivion, the abyss yawning wide beneath him, and he could feel the dizzying pull of it. He thought back to those early days, sleeping in his car, wondering if he'd ever work again, the uncertainty that had haunted him like a shadow. 30 years of work evaporating in 72 hours felt impossible. Yet here he was, watching his career burn to ashes. The studio lights, once illuminating his success, now felt like spotlights shining on his impending failure, exposing every flaw and every misstep. Despite the chaos, beneath the fear was something else. Relief, validation, freedom. He had finally spoken his truth after a lifetime of silence. Whatever happened next, he was done performing palatability. He had broken through the walls he had built around himself, each brick a moment of compromise, a choice to prioritize comfort over authenticity. And now, the world was watching, waiting to see what came next. Then, something unexpected happened. The contestant, Richard, responded. His words, once a casual remark, now held the weight of a reckoning. He posted a video on social media, a shaky confession that quickly gained traction. In it, he spoke about his experience, admitting that he had never fully understood the impact of his words. He expressed regret for his comment, acknowledging that his nostalgia was rooted in privilege and ignorance. He said he had learned something vital that day, that hearing Steve's truth had opened his eyes to the reality he had chosen to ignore. Richard's response shocked everyone who had been watching this story unfold. Many applauded him for his honesty, for acknowledging the harm caused by his words. Others criticized him for not understanding the gravity of what had transpired, arguing that his apology felt insufficient in the wake of the damage done. The conversation exploded online once again, with debates raging about accountability and the complexities of race in America. Steve sat in his dressing room, scrolling through the reactions. He felt a mix of emotions: pride that Richard had taken a step toward understanding, but also frustration that it felt too little, too late. He wanted to believe that this would spark deeper conversations, that Richard's admission would lead to real change. But he was wary. After all, the world was watching, and he understood the fickle nature of public opinion. Would this moment of reckoning be a catalyst for transformation? Or would it fizzle out, leaving behind only echoes of outrage and a cycle of complacency? As he continued to process everything that had happened, Steve felt a flicker of hope amidst the chaos. The video of his moment of truth had ignited conversations across the globe. And now Richard's response added another layer to the unfolding narrative. Perhaps this could be the beginning of something significant. A movement toward understanding and empathy. A chance for people to confront their biases and work toward a more equitable future. But the fear was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. He had spoken his truth. But at what cost? The weight of uncertainty pressed down on him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was still teetering on the edge. Would the backlash continue to grow, or would it subside? Would the network executives finally speak out, or would they remain silent, leaving him to bear the brunt of the fallout alone? Steve took a deep breath, grounding himself in the moment. He had chosen to speak up, and now he had to be ready for whatever came next. He had to embrace the uncertainty, to trust that he had done the right thing by refusing to stay silent. The world was watching, and he had sparked a wildfire of conversation that had the potential to change lives. No matter how this unfolded, he had to believe that his decision to speak truthfully would resonate far beyond the confines of a game show set. As the hours turned into a restless night, Steve found himself reflecting on what it meant to be a voice for his community, to carry the weight of representation in an industry that often sought to silence it. He understood that change was rarely easy, that progress often came at a cost, but he also knew that the fight for justice and understanding was worth it, that every moment spent speaking out against injustice was a moment well spent. In the days that followed, the conversation continued to evolve. Richard's admission prompted discussions about accountability, privilege, and the responsibility of those in power to create inclusive spaces. Steve's moment of truth had sparked a wildfire that spread far beyond the confines of the television studio, igniting a movement that challenged the status quo and demanded change. As he navigated the turbulent waters of public opinion, Steve remained resolute. He had spoken his truth, and he was ready to face the consequences, whatever they might be. The fear of losing everything was still there, but so was the exhilaration of finally being free to be himself, to advocate for those who had been silenced for too long. In the end, Steve understood that this was just the beginning of a much larger journey, a journey toward understanding, compassion, and ultimately, change. The world held its breath as Richard prepared to release his public statement. Everyone expected a defensive non-apology, the kind of carefully crafted response that public relations teams manufacture to minimize damage while accepting zero responsibility. People anticipated the blame shift, the sorry you were offended deflection that had become standard protocol for white people caught saying racist things. The internet was already preparing its outrage, fingers poised over keyboards ready to dissect whatever hollow excuse he would offer. But what came was completely unexpected. A real apology. Richard's statement began with an acknowledgement of exactly what he had said, word for word, without attempting to reframe or soften the comment that had detonated Steve's carefully maintained composure. He didn't claim he'd been misunderstood or taken out of context. He didn't say his words had been twisted or that people were being too sensitive. He took full responsibility without making excuses, without centering his own discomfort, without asking anyone to feel sorry for him. The statement described his upbringing in vivid, unflinching detail. Richard talked about growing up in a bubble of privilege and whiteness, surrounded by people who looked like him, thought like him, shared his unexamined assumptions about the world. He explained how he'd never questioned what he was taught about race, never interrogated the casual comments his family made, never considered that his nostalgia for simpler times might actually be nostalgia for a hierarchy that benefited him at others' expense. Richard wrote about watching Steve's response over and over, each viewing shattering another layer of his own prejudice like glass breaking in slow motion. The first time he watched, he felt defensive, his ego bruised by the public humiliation. The second time, confusion started creeping in, small cracks appearing in the foundation of his worldview. By the third viewing, those cracks had become fissures, and by the 10th, the entire structure had collapsed. He could finally see what Steve had been trying to show him, that his casual comment wasn't innocent or harmless, but a reflection of deeply embedded racism that he'd never bothered to examine. The shame Richard described wasn't the performative shame of getting caught saying something inappropriate, the kind of embarrassment that fades once the news cycle moves on. This was deep shame, the kind that comes from realizing you've caused real harm, from understanding that your ignorance has perpetuated systems of oppression, from recognizing that you've been complicit in the very structures that have made other people's lives harder. He wrote about lying awake at night, replaying the moment, seeing Steve's face transform from performative joy to barely contained rage, understanding that his nostalgia for the old days was really just a wish for Steve to disappear from his television screen. What made Richard's apology extraordinary was what he didn't do. He didn't ask for forgiveness or center himself in the narrative of transformation. He didn't make Steve responsible for his education or expect black people to thank him for finally understanding basic human dignity. He didn't perform redemption or demand applause for doing the bare minimum of acknowledging harm. Instead, he committed to concrete action, laying out specific steps he was taking to dismantle his own racism and support communities he'd harmed through his ignorance. Richard listed the books he was reading, not just bestsellers about race written for white comfort, but challenging texts that interrogated whiteness and privilege and the structures that maintained inequality. He named the organizations he was supporting with both time and money, groups led by black people doing the work of justice and equity. He described the difficult conversations he was having with his family, confronting the casual racism that had been passed down through generations like heirlooms, refusing to let harmful comments slide by unchallenged anymore. He talked about reaching out to local schools and community centers, volunteering his time to listen and learn from people whose experiences differed vastly from his own. Richard explained that he was attending workshops on anti-racism, sitting through uncomfortable sessions where his privilege was named and examined, where he had to confront the ways he'd benefited from systems designed to exclude others. He wasn't doing this for recognition or praise. He was doing it because the work was necessary. because his ignorance had caused harm, because transformation required more than words. Richard's statement included a commitment to use his platform, however small, to amplify marginalized voices rather than speak over them. He acknowledged that his journey of unlearning would be lifelong, that there would be missteps and mistakes, but that he was committed to the process, regardless of how difficult or uncomfortable it became. He understood now that his comfort had come at the expense of others' dignity, and he was choosing differently going forward. People started recognizing how rare genuine accountability actually was. The internet, which had been sharpening its knives in preparation for tearing apart another hollow apology, found itself disarmed. The response began to shift as people read and reread Richard's statement, searching for the usual deflections and finding none. This was what real transformation looked like. Uncomfortable, humbling, ongoing work rather than a one-time performance of contrition. Social media erupted with discussions about accountability and what it meant to actually change rather than simply apologize. People shared the statement widely, using it as a template for what genuine remorse and commitment to growth should look like. Some remained skeptical, arguing that one statement didn't erase the harm or prove lasting change. Others saw it as a beginning, an opening toward the kind of transformation that society desperately needed. Educators started using Richard's statement in classrooms as an example of what accountability could look like when ego was set aside. Therapists referenced it in sessions about growth and change. Community organizers pointed to it as evidence that people could change when confronted with truth. The statement became more than just one man's apology. It became a blueprint for how to respond when you've caused harm, how to move beyond defensiveness into genuine transformation. Steve read the statement alone in his dressing room, tears streaming down his face unchecked. He felt something he hadn't felt in 30 years of performing, of swallowing insults, of making white people comfortable at his own expense. Validation. His moment of truth had actually reached someone, actually changed someone. The risk he'd taken, speaking honestly instead of deflecting with humor, refusing to protect Richard's comfort, potentially sacrificing everything he'd built, had created real transformation. But it was bigger than one contestant's awakening. Steve's unfiltered response had become a catalyst for something he never anticipated. Other black entertainers started speaking their own truths, emboldened by his refusal to perform palatability. Comedians talked about the exhaustion of code switching. Actors described being told they were too ethnic for certain roles. Musicians shared stories about being asked to make their art more palatable for white audiences. The conversation Steve started rippled outward like waves from a stone thrown into still water, giving others permission to stop performing, to stop protecting, to stop making themselves smaller for other people's comfort. Prominent figures in entertainment began sharing their own experiences with racism and microaggressions, stories they'd kept silent about for years out of fear of being labeled difficult or divisive. The floodgates had opened, and decades of suppressed truth came pouring out. Each story validated the next, creating a collective reckoning that the industry could no longer ignore. Production companies started examining their hiring practices. Networks began conversations about representation behind the camera as well as in front of it. And the uncomfortable discussions that had been avoided for generations finally found space. The weight Steve had carried for 30 years, the performance, the code switching, the constant calibration of his words and mannerisms to make white people comfortable, was finally set down. Not because racism was solved or because the industry had fundamentally changed overnight, but because he had given himself permission to stop smiling through it. That permission was contagious, spreading through entertainment and beyond, creating space for authenticity that hadn't existed before. One moment of refusing to swallow racism had sparked a transformation nobody saw coming. The contestant learned what accountability actually means. Not performative apology, but genuine reckoning and ongoing work. Steve learned that truth-telling, no matter how terrifying, can create change that ripples far beyond the initial moment of speaking. The audience learned that their comfort wasn't more important than other people's dignity. And millions of people watching from home learned that nostalgia for the old days isn't innocent. It's a longing for a time when some people didn't have to share space or power or visibility with others. The realization settled over Steve like light breaking through clouds. His entire career had been built on making people comfortable, on being the acceptable black face that white audiences could embrace without feeling threatened. He'd become a master of performance, so skilled at code switching and deflecting that sometimes he forgot what his authentic voice even sounded like. But in that moment when Richard's comment hung in the air like poison, something had broken. The mask had cracked, and underneath was 3 decades of suppressed truth demanding to be heard. Steve thought about all the moments he'd swallowed comments, all the times he'd smiled through microaggressions, all the instances when he'd chosen his career over his dignity. He thought about the young black entertainers coming up behind him, watching to see if it was possible to be successful and authentic simultaneously, or if success required constant performance of palatability. His refusal to smile through Richard's racism had given them something he'd never had: permission to prioritize their humanity over other people's comfort. The transformation wasn't just personal, it was cultural. Conversations about race that had been happening in whispers and private spaces moved into the mainstream. White people who'd never questioned their nostalgia for simpler times started interrogating what that nostalgia really meant. Black people who'd been performing palatability found permission to stop. The entertainment industry, which had operated on unspoken rules about what black performers could and couldn't say, found those rules suddenly up for debate. Steve Harvey had stopped a game show when a contestant said he missed the old days before people like Steve were on television. And in doing so, he started something that couldn't be stopped. The conversation spread beyond entertainment into education, politics, everyday interactions. People started recognizing the cost of code switching, the exhaustion of constant performance, the violence of expecting marginalized people to make their oppressors comfortable. Richard's transformation became a case study in what genuine accountability could look like when someone chose discomfort over defensiveness. His willingness to sit with shame, to do the work of unlearning, to commit to ongoing education rather than one-time apology, showed others what was possible. Not everyone would make that choice. Many would continue to defend their nostalgia, to insist they didn't mean it that way, to prioritize their comfort over others' humanity. But Richard's example proved that transformation was possible for those willing to do the work. Steve sat with the weight of what he'd started, feeling simultaneously terrified and liberated. He didn't know what would happen to his career, whether the network would renew his contract, whether sponsors would stay or flee. But underneath the uncertainty was something solid and unshakable: the knowledge that he'd finally spoken truth after 3 decades of silence. Whatever came next, he'd done the one thing he'd never allowed himself to do. He'd prioritized his dignity over everyone else's comfort. The tears on Steve's face weren't just about Richard's apology or the validation of knowing his truth had reached someone. They were release. 3 decades of suppressed emotion finally finding expression. The weight of performance finally lifted. He'd spent so long being what everyone needed him to be that he'd forgotten what it felt like to simply be himself, unfiltered and authentic. The fear was still there, the uncertainty about what came next. But so was freedom. Steve Harvey stopped the show, and in doing so, he started something that couldn't be stopped. A conversation about the cost of code switching, the violence of nostalgia, the exhaustion of performing palatability, and the possibility of transformation when people choose truth over comfort. One moment of refusal had sparked a wildfire of honesty that was still burning, still spreading, still changing hearts and minds in ways he never anticipated. The old days were gone, and Steve Harvey had helped ensure they would never return.